Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Bulletproof Selling. This is Sean Rhodes. I'm the Chief Sales Sergeant here at Bulletproof Selling. And here at Bulletproof Selling, we believe that hope is not a sales strategy. I was blessed to be able to travel the world with some of the highest performing service members on the planet across a bunch of countries' militaries, studying the systems that they were able to use to help them remove hope from how they operated, how they performed, and how they achieved their missions. And as my career path took me into sales, well, I realized there were so many similarities between what great salespeople were doing and what success actually looked like. So these great salespeople weren't hoping that prospects would call them back. They weren't hoping that leads would turn over and magically generate into customers. They were using process, they were using systems so that they could be more present in their conversations. So over the course of the last few years here at Bulletproof Selling, we've been able to bring on this live stream series and this podcast series, depending on how you're listening, whether you're listening or watching, a variety of guests. Some of them have been best-selling authors. Some of them have been Hall of Fame speakers. A lot of them have led or are leading international sales teams. But the people that I really enjoy having on are those that have been out there in the world on the front lines, seeing what sales actually looks like. They weren't, born in an ivory tower in a sales management position. They worked their way up. They led teams, they did it themselves, and they learned along the way that hope is not a sales strategy. So across the world of those people doing that, there's one name that kept crossing my path, a guy named Steve Weinberg. Now, Steve has a history in sales that would make any sales VP say, well, that's enough to hang your cap on. Let's just go out and, stick to the golf course the rest of the career, because after you've achieved what Steve has achieved, you might think you're at the pinnacle of sales. But Steve has a mindset that just because you've learned a lot doesn't mean that you know it all. And so he's constantly out there learning, growing, working with teams, and really coming up with some brilliant things in the way of sales process. So I'm really excited, without further ado, to bring on to Bulletproof Selling a man I've been looking forward to having as a guest here, Mr. Steve Weinberg. Steve, welcome to Bulletproof Selling.
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be here.
Now, Steve, I got to read your bio. I'm impressed, but not everybody that's tuning into this show has gotten the chance to do that. So tell us a little bit about your history. I mean, all of the sales you've been able to make, the companies you've been able to work for. What is your 90-second overview of the great life in sales that you've had?
Okay, I had a pretty interesting start in sales. I actually am an accountant by training and a CPA, and I went to work for a corporation where they had me implement software packages. And one of the software packages I implemented was the company actually offered me a job in sales. So I took the risk of moving from a very comfortable and very happy environment in accounting to going into sales. And initially, I wasn't successful, but after a while, I figured it out. I'd never had any sales training, and
Hmm.
I became very successful and moved up within the company, which was a startup, all the way up to be VP of sales. And then I was VP of sales of several other software companies and also Nielsen Marketing Research. Later on, I went to work for Deloitte and Touche, and finally with a company called Acuity, which is owned by Relics, a British Dutch conglomerate out of Europe. So while I was there at Acuity, I closed the largest deal in the company's history, which was at a multiple of 8 times the prior largest deal ever. So,
Wow.
and I did that through LinkedIn. So I'm very much a proponent of using LinkedIn for sales, not just for career usage as well.
Awesome, and that is a career, definitely, like I said, to hang one's hat on, and yet you're out there now. You're not just on the back nine playing the links every day. You're still working with sales teams. So tell us a little bit about the organizations that hire you to come in and help them turn their sales around.
Okay, well, typically I'm hired by somebody that has a problem, and usually the problem is that they're not closing enough sales.
Mm,
And what I see is a lot of times is companies have a lot of activity. The salespeople are very busy, but they're not reaching their sales goals. So they bring me in and ask me to take a look at what the issues are. And the most common thing that I find is that they're calling on the wrong prospects.
mm.
And you can waste a lot of time calling on the wrong prospects. And when finally you reach a point where they don't buy, and then you've wasted a lot of time and months and effort. and then you don't reach your sales goal. And what
Yeah,
what
that's
I
right.
found in researching the book was that about 50% of all salespeople do not reach their annual sales target, which is an
And that was an
astonishing
interesting
number.
figure, Steve. I wanted you to dive in on that. How did you come up with that number? Because that's just it blows me away. I don't doubt
It's
that it's true because I see the same thing. But how did you find that
right.
out?
It's actually I found about 5 or 6 different resources. I also found that this goes back years. So
Mm,
even 20, 25 years ago, it was still the same. And what I can't find, what I find I think most astonishing is that companies have accepted this as the norm. So,
hmm.
they figure, okay, we hire a VP of sales, and that 50% of their salespeople won't make their target, and we just go on, and that's really, it's very expensive, it's very unproductive, and I don't think it should be tolerated. I mean,
Hmm.
imagine getting on an airplane where 50% of the time you actually land at the airport, right? Or
So
as or
it's
going
really
into
fascinating that fascinating that you mentioned this analogy because in urban combat, which I got to participate in
right,
dozens of missions where we'd go into Fallujah or Ramadi, places like that. In an urban combat scenario, it's fascinating because the survival rate is about 50% as well. That's the anticipated survival rate. So if we send 10 people into a building to clear it, 5 of them are expected to walk out under their own power. And so what the military had me doing, the reason I was there, because I'm not especially skilled behind a rifle. They had me studying. Well, the teams that are able to make it back out, how are they able to do it? And we realized that they were doing something a little different than putting 10 people together randomly and saying go in there into that house and see what kind of damage you can cause, because there are people in there looking to cause damage back. Right, this is where your prospects are firing back at you. So what did you find then in the organizations that you led and that now you get to coach that have that higher than 50% achievable rate for their goals? What are they doing differently?
well, I think the key thing is, and by the way, sales is nowhere near as dangerous as the military,
I
but
agree.
right, it's not a life or death situation, but it can be very devastating for the people that don't make their numbers. I've seen some really awful things happen. At the minimum, people lose their jobs, and that disrupts their
Hmm.
lives, and companies need to go through a hiring process again. But also, I've seen divorces, families just blown apart, and in one case, a suicide. Uh,
Mm.
so it can be catastrophic in a different way, not anywhere similar to the military. But I think when companies start looking at, what are they doing right and what are they doing wrong, and I think, as you say, look at the systems involved in this, and we need to put in place a repeatable process. I think that's really, sales is succeeding in sales is not a random process. It's not like, it's not like going to the roulette table or the craps table and seeing, what happens. If you want to
Yeah.
succeed in sales, you've got to do the right things all the time, not just occasionally and winning,
What did you tell me
just
about miracles when we started, Steve? I'd love for you to give our listeners that quote again.
right. Well, in response to what you say is hope is not a good strategy
Yeah.
for sales. I totally agree with you. And I have never seen hope work in sales. I am a religious person. I do believe in miracles, but I've never seen a sales miracle in my life. I was in sales for a long time. And
Yeah.
when someone wins a sale, it's usually because they did everything right or most of the things right. And when they
Hmm.
lose a sale, it's usually because they did things wrong. And I would say at least more than half of the time when someone loses a sale, it's because they did something wrong. And the other half of the time, it's because they were calling on the wrong buyer
Hmm.
and not someone that was suitable for them.
So I'd love to hear your opinion on this question, Steve. Something we ask all of our guests here at Bulletproof Selling, and there's a lot of directions this could go based on your background, because I know you've got experience standing teams up, leading them, pursuing large accounts, all of the spectrum of sales. You've been there and done that. So
Right.
for all the teams that you've gotten to work with, for the people that come to you for help now, where do you see salespeople relying on hope more than they should in how they're pursuing prospects, how they're closing those deals, how they're learning from those deals? You mentioned, great sales that you've seen close. it's because most of the things were done right. Well, that means that there's a couple of things that we could probably improve. So, where does hope play in more than any other area in your mind in the sales process?
Well, hope is where they're not recognizing what's going on in the sale. And there's, a lot of
Mm,
times I would do account reviews with salespeople as a sales manager. And I would say to them, how you do it on this account? Are you winning account? Well, they would say, oh yeah, 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 I'm winning. I'd say, well, how do you know you're winning? And they said, well,
mm,
when I call the prospect, they take my calls. They're extremely nice to me. They're responsive. They're respectful. And when I want to have a meeting with them, they're willing to meet with me. So that, I feel really good about that. So there's a definition of hope right there. There's a classic hope. They're feeling really good and they hope things are going to go well. So then I say to them,
mm,
well, I'm glad that they're being nice to you, but what has occurred that makes you feel that this sale is going to close? What what is the real why? Are they motivated?
mm.
What will cause them to buy from you right now? And then I usually get silence, a lot of silence. And they stare at me and they look at me, well, what do you mean by that? And I go, well, you've been calling on them and they're nice to you. And that's great. They make you feel well. But why do you think they're going to buy from you? And
Mm,
maybe 1 out of 10 will actually give me a reason, like, well, the CEO wants this thing done this quarter. That's a really important thing to
right.
them. Well, that's okay. So then you've transferred from hope to reality. But the rest of the people, they're still in the land of hope because
Hmm.
they're feeling good because the prospect is nice to them. And now in the post-pandemic era, they're getting less access to the prospect or buyer. So they don't even get the hope as much as they used to get in the past, where they were able to meet with them and get the feel goods from them because they were nice to them. But hope a lot of times I think comes from the fact that they are being treated nice. Where if they weren't
That's
being
it.
treated
Yeah.
nice by the prospect, then they wouldn't have any hope, and they'd be sitting there trying to figure out what did they do wrong.
So
But
it's
and
almost like they're
sometimes
being lured in by a false hope. Then this person
right,
is
and
respectful. They are receptive, and because so many are not, I can only assume that they're interested in what it is that I'm offering, when that may not
right,
be the
and
case. So you,
what I find is that most buyers are very respectful and they're also very reluctant to give out bad news. So I
Mm,
mean, I don't like to give out bad news, right? I had someone call on me yesterday to sell me a basement to fix up my basement, and the person left, and I didn't give them the bad news that it wasn't going to go with them. So people just they want to be people want to be nice to other people, and they don't like telling them, no, Steve, I'm not going to buy from you. Okay, but the reality is that is a conversation you really want. So
yeah.
you want to encourage people that you're calling on to tell you if they're not going with you. In other words, what I say is that you want to welcome objections and not fight
Hmm.
objections. So every sales training class that I've ever attended, and I've had some training by some really outstanding sales trainers, and all of them were very, very good, and they all had really good nuggets of wisdom. But every single one of them would have a session on how do we overcome objections, and we would do role plays for a day or two, and I called it objection jujitsu. So if they say
Yeah.
this, then you say that, and if they go here, you go there, and it's all about countering objections, and I find that to be absolutely uh, wrong and insulting, actually. So, what I want to
Mm,
hear from a buyer is why don't they want to buy from me? So, if they won't tell me, I'll ask them. And
hmm.
again, switching from the hope conversation, where I hope they'll buy from me, I want to say, okay, you know, Mr. or Miss Prospect, from what I've explained to you, from the proposal I've given to you, why wouldn't you go with me? Or what do you see are reasons why you wouldn't go with me? And when they give you those reasons, then don't fight them. Don't say, well, when they say, well, your price is too high, don't go, no, it's not. I know it's not. Don't do that, and don't insult them and say, well, if you weren't so stupid, you'd understand that what I have is really a good product. That's kind of what the language that people use, but they don't quite say it like that. Instead of that, welcome the objection and say, okay, well, I understand where you're coming from. Let's talk about that further. Let's have a discussion. You
Mhm.
want to honor their objection. You want to say to them, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, let me tell you what other companies or other people have felt about this and how they go on forward with it. And let me explain to you the results that you get if you move forward with our, solution.
That's amazing, Steve. Now, the thing that I find most fascinating about this is that salespeople are usually very unwilling to lose a sale. Like when you call someone, they're
Right.
like, "Hey, they either draw it out so long that you know the deal is lost, or they straight up tell you, "No, I'm just not going to buy from you." A lot of them are devastated. And when I work with companies to start building sales process, I tell usually the VP of sales, you're going to get turned down probably a little more than you did when we started because I'm encouraging your people to actually begin paying attention to what they're doing. And that's going to cause a slight drop, but you're going to make so much more money on the back end because of the next few lost sales that you have. And they say, why is that, Sean? And the analogy I use is I've got $100 bill here. I'm going to put it on the table in front of you. You can either have the $100 bill today or tomorrow. I'll drop 10 of these on the table and you can have those. Which would you prefer? $100 today, $1,000 tomorrow? And inevitably, I'll go for the $1,000 tomorrow. That's what's happened. That's exactly what happens when you lose a sale and you learn from it. Because what
Right.
caused that lost $100 today or that one lost sale today, if I can build a system, not of course it's not too expensive. Look at your competitors. Look what they're charging. To your point, right? Honor their objection, learn from it, and then figure out what can I do at my company to either provide more value, lower the price, because sometimes that's an option, rarely, but sometimes it is. What can I begin to change so that if that objection comes through again, I can head it off at the pass. So it's not even something that leaves the buyer's mouth. Because if you can do that in your marketing, in your value proposition, in your conversations, there's so many ways to head off objections so that they never even enter. They're just not objections anymore because you've overcome it way earlier in the sales process. So, Steve, I'd like to build a sales system around getting to know faster. That's getting to NO faster. Because I'm a firm
Yes.
believer that one, you and I talked about it prior to hopping on here that, or even during this call, going after the wrong prospects is such a waste of time. I'd rather hear no from them on the first call, which means they've disqualified me, I've disqualified them, so I can move on to better prospects. Or if it's a qualified prospect and I'm spending 6 months, 9 months, 18 months cultivating this relationship to finally get to a point where they're in a buying window, they have budget, and they still tell me no, I need to know why so that I can not have that whole process repeat in the future. So we talk about systems build, Steve. We remove hope with every single system. And I know you're a firm believer in this. Every new process or system that I put inside of a sales team or inside of my own actions as a salesperson peels a little bit more hope away because now I have something standardized, process oriented. I don't have to think about
Right.
what the next step is. I can be present with my buyer. So we use an acronym called TRIM because we're trimming hope away from every sale with a new process or a new system. So in this acronym TRIM, the T is the trigger element. So if I'm thinking about building a sales process that gets me to know faster, gets me to know faster from the people that I'm reaching out to, one to disqualify them, so they're disqualifying me, or gets me to know faster with somebody that might be a good prospect so I can learn from, I can figure out what is the issue sooner rather than later before I invest 2 years of calling on them. Where's the trigger in this? Do I want to build this out before I get in front of a prospect? Is it during a conversation? Is it halfway through the sales cycle? Where do you recommend I pull this system off the shelf so that I remind myself, here's how I need to get to know faster?
Well, first of all, what I want to mention is that there is a trap. And the trap is that
Oh,
the longer you call on someone, the more emotionally invested you are in them. And I
uh,
found that in sales myself, when I was a salesperson, the hardest thing for me was to walk away from a sale, to walk away from the
mm,
wrong prospect, even when I realized at some point that they're probably never going to buy. But I've been calling on them for 6 or 9 months. I've had
I've got so much
access to
sunk
the
cost in
decision.
that. Yeah.
Right. I've had access to the decision maker, and I've invested all this time and energy in it. And I hope that there's a glimmer of a chance that I'll
Mm,
close it. And so I still keep calling on them. And that is really it's you're just investing time down the wrong in the wrong place. But going back to what you said, the earlier in the process that you can ascertain whether or not they're the right buyer for you, the better off it is. What
Oh
what
yeah.
I what I recommend is what I call the sweet spot to prospect. So where is the sweet spot? The sweet spot is where you have a motivated buyer that's interested in buying, where you have a product that has a value proposition that meets their solution, and where you have a competitive strength over the others in the marketplace. So if you can find a prospect in that little circle, let's say, I use a Venn diagram, and it's the intersection of those three areas. If you
Hmm.
can find it, your probability is much greater of closing the sale. Now, can you close one with an unmotivated buyer? Yeah, you can, but boy, it's going to take an awful lot. Can you close
Oh yeah.
one where you don't have a competitive strength over others in the marketplace? Sure, you can. Maybe one out of 50. Okay.
Yeah.
And the other 49 you're going to lose. So the sooner that you can figure out whether or not the prospect is in that sweet spot, the better off you're going to be. And you should be, a salesperson should be qualifying consistently throughout the process from
Hmm.
the moment that somebody is a suspect to when they become a prospect and as they move through the pipeline. And at some
Well, Let,
point,
let, us talk about qualifying here in just a second. I want to make
right,
sure I capture the trigger fully because I want to know for me, because I use every sales system that I get to build with one of my guests too. So I need to know that it's going to work for me as well. So it sounds like the trigger element then is making sure before you even start to reach out to somebody that they do meet that intersection of that Venn diagram where there's a need, you
right,
have a solution, and you have a competitive advantage because otherwise you might not hear no for 18 months, even though you're
right.
pursuing them. They're just not the right prospect. But if they are the right prospect, you can hear no sooner, learn from it, and target the next one even better. So, great trigger element. But you mentioned all of the things that you need to do throughout the sales process as far as qualifying, consistently qualifying. I love that idea. So, talk to me about maybe the 4, 5, or 6 things that I can do, like a checklist that I can keep with me
Right.
as I'm making calls, as I'm doing my site visits, as I'm interacting with my prospects to get to know faster. What are those 5 or 6 steps that I should be doing?
Well, I think the salesperson should understand where their best prospects are. What's the best marketplace for what they've sold, and a lot of that can be found by looking at your current customers. Who are they? What vertical market are they in? Now, can you sell? Let's say your company specializes in calling on hospitals and healthcare companies, and along comes somebody else, let's say a bank, and they want to take a look at what you have. Should you say no to them? Well, probably, at least initially, but
Hmm.
your chances, if you've done very well in one market like healthcare, I would try to focus on that market more.
Mm,
Now, if someone comes along and you meet with someone and they're a bank and they go, well, we're interested in this too. I would really want to dig further, really hard, say, okay, well, wait a minute. What is it about what we have that interests you? And I would want them to sell me on why I should continue with them.
I
Okay.
love that.
So,
This step one being you say no first as the salesperson. Have
right,
no at the front of your lips for anybody that doesn't look like that ideal prospect. That'll save you so much time in prospecting. I had to learn this one the hard way. That's how I know.
right,
But for the second step, I'm curious if I'm in front of a prospect that does meet that Venn diagram. They are in healthcare. They are in my target
right.
market. How soon in the sales process do I need to be eliciting a no from them?
Well, again, and here another step is to try to get access to the key decision maker, or what Miller
Hmm.
Hyman calls the economic buyer. If
Hmm.
you're denied access to that person, that's a bad sign. Okay, then you have to figure out, okay, why is that? Now, some people are just very, very, very busy and they will not meet with a seller. Okay, well, we need to find that out. I sold to Amazon. It was really tough to get to the decision maker, but I finally did. And once I did, the sale went a whole lot faster.
Hmm.
because I had that access. And if there were any uh, rough bumps on the road, I could reach out to that person and say, okay, what's really going on here? What's the problem? And then they would tell me, well, the lawyers want this, or the procurement people want that, and so that I would get more information than I would get normally from from the contact
Right.
that I had. So a good sign is whether or not you have access to the decision maker. If you don't, then you have to understand why is that. Now, does that mean
Yeah.
you
So
should never
say
call
no to people
and
that
say,
aren't the decision maker. I like that.
right? Yeah, I mean, does that mean you should ever not call on one that's not? No, but at some point you need to have that. The other thing is sometimes you'll be told who the decision maker is, and it's the wrong person.
Mm,
And by the way, it may not even be intentional. They may think that's a decision maker, but it really isn't the decision maker. So the decision maker is the one that has the veto power that can do yes or no and sign the contract.
hmm.
So if the committee or the evaluation group says we want to go with vendor A, and the decision maker says no, I want to go with vendor B, that's your decision maker. Okay,
Love it.
so
Yep.
yeah, I mean, the decision maker always has the veto power and can always override anything else. And what's happened more recently that's made it more difficult for salespeople is that a few years ago we would call on one or two or three people and try to sell them in a company. Today, everything is very consensus oriented, and we need to sell a group of people, normally a cross functional team and a group that has many different motivations for why they want something. They each have an agenda that's very different. So
Yep.
what you hear from one person in a meeting could be totally different from another one, and a salesperson needs to discern, okay, where do I go with this? And it's made it much
Yeah.
more difficult for the salesperson.
So we talked a couple of steps about how to hear no sooner, but I would love if maybe the last two steps in this repeatable process, because we're still on the
Right.
R and trim here, where what do I learn from a no so that that no never enters my world as a salesperson again?
Well, sometimes no is good, right? So as you mentioned earlier, if they're never going to buy, then no is the best news you can get, and then you go on to someone else. And I tried to give that message to salespeople that work for me, and they a lot of times don't want to hear it because the people have been nice to them, right?
Yeah.
So you know, nice people are causing all the problems. But the but what we need to do is figure out, you know, do they have the budget to do this year? Are they motivated to do it this year? Is this something that's a want or a need? If it's a need, it's a whole lot more important than a want. Is there some kind of a uh, is there some kind of a reason that you're not aware of that is causing this evaluation? For example, the big sale that I had occurred because there was a government regulatory agency that was absolutely jumping all over this company and threatening to fine them if they didn't improve their processes. Well,
Mhm.
all of a sudden, something that wasn't budgeted became very, very important. So,
Yeah.
whether or not something is in the budget is really a good clue, but it's not necessarily a deal killer if it's not in the budget. Uh, you need to justify it more. The ROI needs to be there. And
So it's really
in the
to find
case,
out why then, and more specifically, and there's like a process to walk through where the five whys. We can't buy
right,
from you today. Why? There's no budget. Why is there no budget? This wasn't budgeted for last year. We're on an annual budgetary cycle. Why are you on an annual budgetary cycle? That's just the way we've always done things, and you can go down that line enough to really get to the reason. And maybe the reason is not that they're never going to buy from you, but they just can't buy from you until September 1st. I know
right,
exactly where I'm going to be on September 1st then. And, the deal might still be in play. And so there's a lot of great things that you can do with a no, in addition to just qualifying them out of your pipeline, but learning, all right, if that's the case with this company, maybe a question I need to build in earlier in my sales process is what budgetary cycle are you all on? And that way I can hear
right.
no a lot sooner or a not now, which is also okay. I'm very willing to hear a not now because that frees me up to call in the next person. They might be able to say yes. So we've got trigger element, making it repeatable. The iron trim is where we make this process improvable because I know the market's going to change. Inflation's going to do something up, down, sideways, we don't know quite yet. There's a lot of things that are going to change out there in the world. And if I don't adapt to this system, to a changing world, I'm going to be selling like we did back in 1975, which, as effective as it was then, probably not as effective as it could be today. So how would I look at improving this system, Steve, so that I could get to know sooner?
Well, having more checkpoints along the way. And
Hmm.
there's other things that need to be done. For example, you need to take a look at what their financial situation is and what their market situation is. And one of the things I recommend is that read their annual report, read their quarterly reports, read what their CEO is saying is really important to them this year. Is it important for them to enter new markets? Is that
Hmm.
something, do they want to go into Asia or Europe this year? Well, if you've got something that'll help them do that, then you're connecting with the message that the CEO is giving the marketplace. So
Hmm.
again, that's another checkpoint to have. But throughout the whole process, do reality checks and say, okay, what would cause them to buy? And in my mind, when I meet with, by the way, when I meet with salespeople, one of the one of the sessions I usually have with them is I say to them, "Who's your number one competitor?"
Hmm.
And I get a list, from people get really emotional, by the way, when they start talking about the competition. They'll say, well, this darn company here, they're driving me crazy. They're in all my deals. And I look at them and I go, you know what? They're not your number one competitor. Actually, they're actually helpful to you. And I can explain that as well. But your number one competitor is do nothing. Okay. Status
Hmm.
quo, lack of incentive to buy. So one of your checkpoints is explain to me why this company is willing to make a change. Are they willing to disrupt their current processes? Are they
Hmm.
willing to add people or change people? Are they willing to uh, bring in new ideas? Is the current so what about the current solution isn't working? By the way, who built the current solution? Is it the evaluation team that you're working with? I mean, that's important
Yeah, that could
information,
make an
right?
impact on the sale.
Right, exactly. So again, explain why do nothing is not a competitor. And do nothing is usually when you don't win, do nothing wins more than you do. And
Right.
again, that darn competitor that's giving you fits, they actually help you in the marketplace because they're calling on the prospect and explaining to the prospect why they should buy as well. So all you need to, they're helping validate the need and the marketplace for you as well. And all you need to do is if somebody's going to buy, you just have to make sure they buy from you and not from the other guy. But the
That's
worst
right. Yeah,
situation is that they don't buy anything, right?
we had a
And
saying in the
that
military along these lines that the biggest gap in our defense was apathy, and
right,
that's being lackadaisical on post. You could have the most barbed wire in the world, the most sandbags, but if you're lazy, the enemy will find a way in. So I love this idea of being on it, not just agreeing, we're just going to keep the status quo. Especially as a salesperson, if you're not constantly learning, and I know anybody listening to this live stream or this podcast, you're already of the mindset I need to be improving constantly because that's what keeps me active, keeps me relevant. But apathy is absolutely what will kill you more than anything. So I love that idea for an improvement measure. Now, M and trim is actually measurement. Because if I'm taking the time to build this process out, to better qualify my people, to reach out and ask more impactful and potentially deal killing questions, because I'm trying to get to know sooner in every sale, I need to measure and figure out, is this thing working for me, or should I just go back to the way I was doing it? So, what do I need to measure, Steve, to make sure that this system of getting to know faster is getting me better results? Is it just closed sales? Is it pipeline velocity? What do I need to be looking at in hard metrics to see, is this working?
before I get to that, one of the ways that I was able to determine whether or not my value proposition was resonating with them was I would ask them to tell me what the value proposition is. Instead of me
Mm,
telling them, I'd say, well, what is it about what I have that you find valuable? And if they can't articulate that, that's a clue as well that they don't understand what you have and they may not buy.
yeah, you got to
But
back up earlier then.
exactly, if they can't explain to you why what you have will help them out, then why would they buy from you?
I'm going to add that into the repeatable steps because that's a brilliant one. Yeah. So, talk to me about
Right.
measurement, Steve. What am I looking at to make sure that this thing is worth continuing?
Well, people people get fooled by the size of their pipeline. So when I meet with
Mm,
people, I'd say, well, explain to me what your pipeline is, and they would say, well, I got all these deals here, and I go, okay, where are they at? And salespeople are very notorious for being, even really, really good salespeople that close a lot of business are bad forecasters. Okay, so one of the things that I always looked at is if they said to me, well, I've got this deal that I forecast to close this month. And I'd say, well, have they reviewed the contract yet? Have you met with their legal people? Have you talked to them? And they'd say,
mm,
no. And I go, well, you know what? It's not going to close this month. So if you haven't done that, so again, every step of the way, we need to look and say, okay, what should be done at that step? And
mm,
again, I explained some of that in the book that if you're expecting something to close, then there's certain messages or certain activities that should have occurred by that point in time. So these need to be validated. So if you have everybody has a process, let's say it could be 4 steps, it could be 5, it could be 8. So at every step, we should look and say what should occur at that step to be valid for
mm.
that prospect to be valid at that step. If you're forecasting this to be closed this month and you still haven't been told that you won the deal, do you think it's do you think that's going to close this month? Okay, there goes your then we
Right.
go back to the hope. Then I get a hope. Well, yeah, I hope it'll be done this month. Well,
Yeah,
guess
yeah.
what? Well, don't go spend your commission check yet, okay? Because it's not going
Right.
to happen. Even if it's
It's brilliant then
December
to look at
1st.
the pipeline stages we have. I love the idea of then
Right,
building in not only, what qualifies a deal to be in that stage, but we need to have these 5 things in this stage, and now we have 10 things in the next stage and 15 in the next stage,
right.
but to also have each stage to ask the question, if they're in a decision maker identified stage, for instance, all we know is the name of the buyer, the person with the signatory power on the check. What are the no's that I should be asking for in that stage?
And
What is
if they're
motivating
the
that decision maker? And if nothing's motivating, then the deal's not in, right?
right. Well, again, it could happen, but it's not likely to happen. So
Yeah,
then what I would tell someone is I would only call on this one after call on everybody else that's much more important or
yeah,
more likely. So shuffle the deck and put them at the bottom. So,
yep,
what I would
yep.
look at are all the clues that we want to hear. Again, uh, do they have a discerned need? Are they motivated to buy? Why are they motivated to buy? Why are they motivated to buy now versus later? How much pain are they really in? Are they, in so much pain that they'll do anything, they'll break their budget in order to fix it?
Mhm.
Who's calling this? Who's the one that's responsible for us being there? That's, by the way, a great question that I ask salespeople. When they call in the account, I go, well, who called you in? Well, I was called in by Nancy. Well, who told Nancy to call you in? Okay. Or did
Mm,
Nancy decide to go on a discovery trip? Well,
yep.
then if you push them back and say, and where they go back to Nancy and then they call Nancy up and they, by the way, Nancy, what was the origination of your interest in this? And they go, well, okay, well, Carol, the vice president, said to me, that it was really important for me to get a solution in this area and to do it this quarter. Wow, that's great information, isn't it? So then,
Yep. Love it.
then we know, why is Nancy asking these questions? Why are we on this? Why are we spending time? So all these should be systematic and should be in your qualification checklist. And as I mentioned earlier, as we should validate every place in the pipeline where the prospect is at. If somebody is moving them through the pipeline and they haven't had that activity that you've determined that should occur at that place, then the sales manager needs to bump them right back to where they were
Yep.
before and not let them forecast to close. Because salespeople are, most salespeople are just overly optimistic and they give
Yeah,
you
and this is
uh,
how we peel hope out of the system. So this has been
right.
an amazing. I want to make sure that salespeople have a chance to go out there and use it. So I want to put them back on calls, get them sending emails, get them visiting prospects. Steve. So you mentioned a book a couple times. How do people get access to that book? How do we get deeper into your world? How do people get in touch with you if they've liked what they've heard here?
Thank you for asking, Sean. The
Yeah.
book is named Above Quota Performance, and the subtitle is Tips and Techniques to Help a Salesperson Exceed in the world today, in the sales world today. They can find it at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, or through my website at www.steveweinbergsales, one word, STEVEWEINBERG sales.com. It's also available at Walmart, I
Wonderful.
found out.
Oh, that's neat. Good for you, man. And then,
Walmart.com, I
of
should say.
course, you mentioned LinkedIn, so people can also find you there, I imagine.
Yes, I'm very active on LinkedIn. I'm a huge believer of the power of LinkedIn for networking and for business development. I love leading sessions, and I've done this for companies on how to better use LinkedIn. I have found that people rely on LinkedIn for their careers, but I would say maybe 5 to 10% of salespeople rely on LinkedIn to help them actually develop a sales pipeline, which is
Mhm.
amazing to me because it's a free tool, it's useful, and there are literally millions of company decision makers that are on LinkedIn and accessible.
Awesome. And so we'll definitely have to have you back to talk about LinkedIn. I know we could spend another half hour, 40 minutes talking just about LinkedIn, Steve. So thanks so much for that. I'm going
Absolutely.
to make sure that your site's in the show notes, so anybody that's interested can go access more of you, get more of this brilliance. For us here at Bulletproof Selling, of course, make sure that you are subscribed up to our YouTube channel where every one of these conversations is archived absolutely free. And of course, if you're listening to us, Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, make sure you're leaving us a review there. That helps this show get in front of more salespeople. And of course, every one of these sales systems is transcribed out into something that you can pull off the internet and use over at bulletproofselling.us. Check out our blog section where Steve's blog is going to live permanently as a sales system on the power of getting to know sooner. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today and serving the sales community as you've been doing for so long in your life. It's great to get that wisdom. And let's get out there, man. Let's make selling bulletproof.
Thanks, Sean. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.